Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session for 2:45. Right now, I'd like to bring to you Mr. Joel Rennick, who will go through identity, security, all this stuff. He is the director of Jamf Connect and NoMAD. So give it up for Joel.
Thank you very much. Dark mode, sorry. That joke was actually funnier than I expected it to be at the keynote this morning. But anyway, so good. Welcome. We're talking about identity today. Identity sometimes can get very long and lengthy. But it's JNUC 2019, and that's me. I guess that's medium mode. That's neither light nor dark. Kind of two things we wanted to cover today. We knew that there's a lot of stuff going on with identity. It's a quickly changing environment. There's a lot of different terms and other pieces. So we'll go through a bit of an identity word salad with a little bit of history looking back at what identity has been over the past, and then where we're going forward with identity. And then for the second half, which I'll find more entertaining, so I hope you will as well. That's not the joke. For the second half, we'd actually get into using a little bit of OpenID Connect and getting into the tokens. OpenID Connect can be a bit of a kind of opaque environment that can scare off a few folks. We've had a lot of time to work with it. We know some of the idiosyncrasies. So I wanted to kind of show you some of the pieces that go on under the covers, and then actually show you how you can use it to your own advantage. So with that, identity throughout history. No. I thought about like starting with keys and Roman times and things like that, but that seemed a little bit deep than what we needed to be for this. So if we were doing this session 10 years ago, if we were at Macworld San Francisco or something like that, we would have been talking about identity, and we would have been talking about identity in terms of what's up here, right? We would have been talking about LDAP and Kerberos. My wife always joked that when I worked at Apple, all I did was get on the phone and yell about LDAP and Kerberos. All right, those days are mostly behind me. But primarily when we were talking about LDAP and Kerberos, we were even more specifically talking about Active Directory. So Active Directory being a combination of LDAP and Kerberos. As Mac admins, that was most of what we are interfacing with as far as identity or directory services go from that standpoint. Anybody still using Open Directory? Oh, we got a few hands. All right, cool. Yeah, Ross, no. Really? Okay. All right. Well, fair enough. So Open Directory being LDAP and Kerberos, but not Active Directory. So we would have talked a little bit about that. And then, anybody still on Novell? Wow. Wow. I was not expecting that. For those of you on the live stream, there were two hands in the almost front row going up. Okay. Well, good to know. And you might have been chatting about eDirectory, right? Because that was what Novell was called. Maybe we had a smattering of Red Hat had free IPA, I think is what it is now. So they might be out there. But again, they were all combinations of LDAP and Active Directory, or LDAP and Kerberos. We're using LDAP for the user user identification, and then Kerberos for the authentication part of that. So since 2000, like I said, we've been primarily talking about Active Directory, heavily Windows focused, launched with Windows 2000. And since then, it required a domain, you had a bind, you had a lot of heavyweight pieces. There was a lot of on-prem that had to be done with it and things like that. And so for the large point of at least OS 10, right, going back since 10.3 was, I think, the first Active Directory plugin. This is what we are thinking about when we are talking about identity. And it kind of locked us into a very specific way of thinking that we don't have to worry about now, or at least we have options now that we didn't have before. So that leads us to the new hotness. This is where we get into the word salad. Security Assertion Markup Language. Ooh, yeah. All right, and this is commonly known as SAML. We'll get into a little bit about what's specific about SAML. You'll hear this a lot, and this is sometimes used as kind of shorthand for modern authentication. And effectively what this means is you're using an identity provider or something that's not LDAP and Kerberos. It's usually token-based. All right, so you get a token which if you squint a little bit looks a lot like a Kerberos ticket but isn't. All right? But if you're familiar with Kerberos, you can kind of think of tokens like tickets, and it starts to make a little bit more sense. So SAML is something that's out there, and you'll also hear a lot about OAuth 1, OAuth 2, and then OpenID Connect. So these are similar to SAML, but not the same. However, and I'm guilty of this myself, a lot of times the terms get commingled frequently. And so you'll hear SAML referring to maybe what really is OAuth, and OAuth referred to as SAML. And a lot of this just gets lumped under the topic of modern authentication. And so what modern authentication really means is something that's web-based, usually using some form of RESTful API, and ideally has the ability to use multi-factor and is a lot more extensible than what we're used to with just LDAP and Kerberos that's in there. All right, so before we get any further, and since we had all the white slides on the main stage, I thought we'd have a couple of white slides to blind you up here. So the first thing we need to keep in mind is authentication versus authorization. And this is important because when we talk about OAuth and OpenID, OAuth is actually authorization, OpenID is authentication, all right? And the difference between authentication and authorization, authenticate, that's to establish as genuine. This is when you're actually signing in. I sign in as Joel, I have a username, I have a password, maybe I have a token or something else. That identifies me as who I am. That's the process of authentication. Just because I've authenticated as Joel doesn't mean I get anything. Doesn't mean I get a file share or anything else. It just means that I've identified myself as Joel. On the authorized side, this is when somebody has already been authenticated and now they get certain services, resources, whatever else based upon that. So authentication and authorization. And the reason why that's important, and authentication is who you are, authorization, what you can do, that's kind of a nice shorthand for that. The reason why it's important is because some of these technologies only do one and some of them only do the other. And so a lot of times, you know, specifically for OAuth and for OpenID Connect, they're used together to then provide a more robust environment. All right? So with SAML, SAML Security Assertion Markup Language, commonly focused on SaaS, who's using Okta or Azure or something else with Jamf Pro? All right? So a good chunk of the room, you're using SAML. And if you went through this process, was it easy? Yeah, maybe, as long as you follow the directions. But there was like 3 or 4 steps. You had to get a certificate. You had to get a couple of other things to set that up. So that's SAML. It's older in comparison to OAuth and certainly in comparison with OpenID Connect. And it involves a few more steps. You had to have that certificate. And part of that means it's fairly complicated, used by Jamf Pro. Self-service uses it because it's just going back to Jamf Pro. But it's not as good for a native application. That certificate that you use for Jamf Pro to connect to Okta or Azure, you really wouldn't want to put that on all of your Macs. You wouldn't want to take something that's fairly sensitive in that fashion and send it all out to your endpoints, because then some bad things could happen. So this is one of the reasons specifically why Jamf Connect, and this is really about Jamf Connect, just about the general sense of things, but it's why we did not use SAML for anything that we're doing. Because of this requirement that it was more focused on SaaS applications, things that would be living in your tenant where you wouldn't necessarily have to worry about the security of all the pieces around that. All right? And this is, and we're not going to get into this, but this is a Azure SAML flow. Azure's got some really nice kind of diagrams so you can kind of see the whole process where the user is working with an application. The application is throwing it back to an identity provider. The identity provider is authenticating the user. It then generates a token, which then gets sent back to the service. The service then uses that token to authorize the user, and then good things happen from there. So there's multiple steps that are involved in this. And with any kind of modern authentication, this is what you're going to see with an identity provider. That you have some sort of hosted solution, typically, a Jamf Pro instance. You're going to that. The user doesn't realize, but they're actually getting redirected back to Azure, back to Okta, back to Ping, back to wherever you may be using for authentication. And then once that part has been cleared, you're then being passed back to that service. All right? And we'll show this in a lot more detail in a little bit and even show you it as it works. So that's how kind of the handoff goes for this. You may have seen this. This is like a SAML example. It's all XML. It's pretty opaque and kind of hard to do anything with. All right, kind of sometimes specific to the service. You can get some libraries that work with it, but it's usually not a fun or an enjoyable process. I said the enjoyable part of this was at the end. This is not the enjoyable part. All right, so that's what a SAML assertion looks like, and this is what's used by Jamf Pro to say, okay, you're a cool person. You can come in, and maybe you're an admin, and you'll be able to do things over there. All right, so this is what SAML looks like. And this is a SAML example, so this is right out of Jamf Pro, and some of the things that you might have to tweak or turn on to be able to do this. OAuth. OAuth started at Twitter, and it was a way of using your Twitter account to sign in to MySpace. Can I use that? Sure, why not? Anybody here from MySpace? Yeah. All right, cool. MySpace, beautiful. All right, so I can... Okay, perfect. All right. So you're a MySpace user.
I am.
All right, but you don't work for MySpace.
I do not.
All right, and MySpace still exists.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So you can use your Twitter account to log into MySpace or something else like that, and that's what the original part of OAuth was used for, to kind of take very disparate accounts, very disparate services that may not know about each other, and by logging into one, being able to sign into another. And this was one of the first kind of understandings that maybe a normal user would have a hard time keeping 15 or 20 or 300 different passwords to sign into 300 different services. And from there, it's grown into a very common process where now on almost any internet service, right, you can sign in with Facebook, you can sign in with Google, now you can sign in with Apple. All of that is an offshoot of OAuth, all right? And OAuth is still being used under the covers, but it's solely focused on authorization. So OAuth is the way of saying, this is a user I trust, they've signed into my service, I'm going to give you this OAuth token so you're able to then allow that user to do something else. All right? But it is not the actual act of authenticating the user. In the initial case of Twitter, Twitter would take a username and password. That was the authentication. They would generate an OAuth token, and then the OAuth token would go from there to MySpace and then be used to allow you into your MySpace account there. All right? So this is how the pieces are starting to fit together. OpenID Connect is an authentication layer built on top of OAuth. Because it was cool that OAuth was there and able to allow you to share tokens between different services, but then you might have 18 different ways of signing in. And maybe Twitter was using username and password, but Facebook was using a push notification to your phone, and Google was using something else entirely different. So everybody wanted to have a way of putting this all together and having kind of a common way of doing that. And so this is where OpenID Connect has come from. Fairly recent, maybe in the last 2 or 3 years, really taken off in the last, say, 18 months, that a lot of folks have really started using this. As you see, as time goes on, because of its simplicity, a little more of its extensibility, I would suggest you'll see a lot more OpenID Connect than you will see SAML. They're not necessarily competing, but you typically pick one or the other, and OpenID Connect combined with OAuth is a little bit simpler to put together. My opinion, others can disagree, but there we are. All right, with OpenID Connect, you also see this understanding with SAML, for example. When you got the SAML assertion, that XML that I showed you before, you would only get information about your specific user or the specific things that other service needed to read and understand. With OpenID Connect, we started to get this concept of, let's get an ID token. Let's get effectively a user record that's kind of wrapped up, packaged, and able to be sent out to another service so that other service can learn more about you. We do a lot of work within Jamf Connect with those OpenID tokens because we use that as your user record. Right? When you move away from LDAP, you don't have a way of looking up other people. You don't have a way of looking up your home address, your wherever your home folder is, all of those kinds of things that were part of your user record. Well, now that can become part of the OpenID Connect ID token. So we now have a kind of a nice packaged up token. I'll show you one of these in a little bit, and you can see all the information about it. All right? Some good stuff to do. The authentication is done by the IDP, so this is where you're going back to Okta, Ping, Azure, take your pick. There's a lot of them out there now, and you're able to authenticate there, get these tokens. These tokens are then used, and like I said, if you're familiar with Kerberos tickets, A token is kind of sort of like a ticket. It gives you access to other services and things like that. Here's an OpenID Connect flow. I've got a much better representation of this, but this gives you kind of this understanding that there's a number of different pieces, and you end up hitting a lot of endpoints on the other side. And it's also a very similar flow in that when I go to MySpace, right, because that's where you start on MySpace, you say, I want to sign in. MySpace would redirect you to Twitter. You'd sign into Twitter. You'd then have a token from Twitter. It would redirect you back to MySpace, and then you'd be able to post your latest singles, releases, albums, something like that. Cool. All right, so this is effectively the same as what we showed you with SAML. There's a few more pieces to it. This is what an OpenID token looks like. That's easy, right? You can see my name, my birthday is in there. So it is base 64 URL encoded, which is slightly different from base 64. Standard base 64 has like 3 characters that aren't valid in a URL, like a dash and a slash and a few other things. So base 64 URL encoded is like base 64, but they just kind of threw out those extra characters. Who needs them anyway? All right, so your OpenID token is base 64 encoded. It is cryptographically signed. A couple other cool things. I'll show you some web pages that decode this so you can see what's going on. All right, there's a lot of libraries out there if you're using Python, JavaScript, whatever else. JOSE, JavaScript, something, I forget what it stands for, but that's one of the ones that you can use to decode all of this. You won't have to write a line of code yourself. All right. Examples of SAML, OAuth, OpenID Connect. We've got Google, Okta, Ping, Salesforce. Salesforce is an OpenID Connect provider. We can sign you into your Mac with your Salesforce account. Nobody's really asked us for that, but you can. Yahoo is an OpenID Connect provider. I can sign you into your Mac with your Yahoo account. Nobody's asked for that, but you can. We've got OneLogin and a few of the others that are out there as well. So there's a number of SAML, OpenID Connect, OAuth providers that are out there. And this seems to be definitely the growing trend, is that a lot more of the IDPs are providing this, because it is kind of a nice, very established way of doing this interaction between all the stuff. So OpenID Connect for people that don't care. We have Okta, we have your Jamf Pro instance, and we have a Mac. On your Mac, you open up a browser and you say, I want to go to my Jamf Pro instance because I'm going to do some management. When you do that, Jamf Pro goes, I have no idea who you are. We should really have somebody authenticate you so I can decide if I should let you in. This is where Jamf Pro then goes over to Okta, because you've set up the SAML integration so that you have that. Jamf Pro goes to Okta. Okta says, OK, show them this login window. That login window is no longer your Jamf Pro instance. If you look at the browser history or the browser status bar, whatever, address bar, you'll see you're not connected to your Jamf Pro server anymore. Instead, Jamf Pro has redirected you, or in some cases, they'll put it into a frame in the window, so maybe you don't go to another page. It has redirected you back to the identity provider. At this point in time, you are talking directly to Okta. Okta will then authenticate you by validating your username, your password, whatever multi-factor, Keynote graphics, look at that. Whatever multi-factor process you have, you shouldn't laugh. That's an ooh moment. There you go. All right, see, usually we have the applause sign and some of the other stuff up here, but we'll work on that. So you do whatever you need to do with that identity provider. That identity provider then gives you a token. In this particular case, we'll use a ticket. All right? That ticket then gets sent back to Jamf Pro. Jamf Pro then can decrypt that ticket. Actually, decrypt isn't the wrong word. Decode it. It's not encrypted, but it is signed. Can decode that ticket, can then turn it into something that you can use. And this is where you get logged in. It can go take that code, send it back to Okta, get a little bit more information if it needs to. That's part of the OpenID Connect protocol. And then we good? Yep. Look at that. Ooh, see? Appropriate. Thank you. All right. And with all of that happens, then you've got your user information. You've been both authenticated and authorized. And now you can see your Jamf Pro console there and be able to do things. So again, in kind of very broad strokes, and there's some people here from identity providers, but they haven't thrown tomatoes at me yet, so I think I've got this relatively right, that this is kind of the process. The important takeaway for this is just understand it's not really happening on the Jamf Pro side. when you do this authentication, Jamf Pro doesn't know who you are, doesn't know what your password is, doesn't know any of these things. Instead, it's sending you to another system. That other system, your identity provider, is establishing who you are, generating some tokens, sending those tokens back to Jamf Pro. Jamf Pro then acts accordingly based upon that. All right? So as long as you can walk away from this, I've done my job, and you understand that it's not just here. And a corollary to this, or maybe the opposite of a corollary, if you were using Active Directory, you would have sent your username and password to Jamf Pro. Jamf Pro would have then passed that off. So Jamf Pro would have sent that to Active Directory. And that's where problems occur because Jamf Pro then knows what your password is and things like that. The beauty of this system, Jamf Pro not only doesn't know your password, it never sees you enter it. Okay? So your secrets are still kept, everything in your identity provider. Jamf Pro is just a service that you're using during this process. Other good, I'm not entirely certain where I got that image, but it's a good one. All right, so the other takeaway out of this, because Jamf Pro doesn't know what your password is, this process, for good or bad, in most cases good, ends up being kind of a password roach motel. I couldn't ask Jamf Pro what your password is. I couldn't get it out of it. It wouldn't know. It wouldn't be able to tell me. Instead, I've communicated directly with Okta. I've validated my password there, and I have no way of sharing that because Okta won't do that back to Jamf Pro. There's goods and bads with that. This is one of the reasons why at the login window with Jamf Connect, we have to kind of do two operations. One is to validate you through OpenID Connect, make sure you are who you are, but then the Mac still requires a password, right? And some of this is good because there's a lot of new authentication mechanisms, passwordless, the FIDO keys stuff I showed off yesterday and this morning. All of those don't have a password as we know and understand them today associated with them. So not only can I not share the password, in some cases, there's absolutely no password to be shared because the user never entered in a password to be authenticated in the first place. All right, so demo time. What I'm going to show you here, we've got a little app. Close out of this. Here's my little app. And if I find where my mouse went, there it is. All right, cool. So this is very, you can do this also. We've got a Jamf Connect configuration app that you can download and go do this exact same thing with. So what we have here, I've got an Okta authentication window. I've just put in some various pieces of information using an Okta instance. There's my redirect. There's the actual application that I'm authenticating against, my tenant information in here. So this is your Okta sign-in. If you're using Azure, you would call this your HIRD or your home realm detector, right? It's where you put your username in, possibly your password, some other things. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to put in my username, hit next. Now I'm being prompted for my password. And this isn't really relevant necessarily to the conversation here, but it's important information. You'll notice even Apple has started doing kind of a two-step process. When you sign into Apple Business Manager now, you first type in your username, and then you have a password prompt, right? All of this is in preparation for maybe you don't have a password, right? If you're using passwordless, if you're using push. In Okta, we can do factor sequencing, so I'd get my YubiKey would be, hit, or my FIDO key, or something else, right? So you may not have a password with you, which is why a lot of these systems are now having kind of a two-step operation. In this Okta case, for example, I can go up here and I can pull down, I could use Okta Verify because I have set that up for this user, or I could use my password. I'm just going to type in my password. All right, now I'm being authenticated by Okta, and when that's all done, I have tokens over here. And in Jamf Connect configuration, we'll actually show you these tokens as well. If you've used the app, you probably saw the tokens. You're like, that's exciting, but I really don't know what to do with this. We're going to show you. All right, so you can take this token, and right here, I'm just going to hit copy, and there's a couple of web pages you can hit, and the one that is one of the nicest ones is jwt.io. Because what this technically is a Java Web Token. And so if I go into here and I just paste this Java Web Token in, it actually decodes it into all of its relevant parts. And if its relevant parts are, and you can see, this is my ID token, and there's three parts to it. there's a header up here which is in red, and this says that the key ID that I was authenticated with was this, and the algorithm was an RSA 256 signature that was done on it. All right? For your purposes, you can usually ignore this. The fuchsia, is that the right term for this color? Is that good? Sure. Audience says yes. All right. So this is your actual ID token, and if I zoom in on this, you can see that I actually have what you would think of as a user record. In here is my short name, my email. It was issued by my Jamf Connect Okta preview tenant. That's the audience. That's the actual application I use to authenticate against. And if you hover over these, I kind of like these. They're nice. If you hover over them, it'll tell you issued at second since the UNIC epoch, expiration time, the unique identifier for the token, how I was authenticated. I was authenticated by my password, preferred username, a bunch of stuff that's in here. We do a lot with these in Jamf Connect to identify the user. Since we don't actually have a directory service, we don't have an LDAP or something else like that to go against. Instead, we use this ID token to kind of parse out what your username is and things like this. Depending on your identity provider, you can actually put more information here than maybe you thought of. All right. In many cases, when you're using Azure, Okta, something else, you may be mastered back into AD, you may be mastered into Workday, you may be mastered into another system that's your source of truth. In many cases, you can have those systems pass through attributes into this ID token. All right. In this case, there's no groups in here, but I could have groups that were added into this. So I would be able to then parse out, am I a member of an admin group? Am I a member of the Cool Kids Club? You know, things like that that might be a part of my ID token. So in a modern authentication system where you're using OpenID Connect, this effectively becomes your user record. All right. And it comes as a result of the authentication process that you go through. Down at the bottom here, in this blue, this is the signature. All right? And so by looking at this information up here, there's a key ID here. That key ID references a metadata document that Okta has, and that key ID then corresponds to a publicly available public key. All right? So if I were to validate this token all the way through, I would look at that key ID. I would go back to my Okta tenant. My Okta tenant would then show me an XML document, JSON, I believe, actually, that has the key IDs associated with a longer public key. That public key I would then get in, and I would validate the signature down at the bottom against that public key. If that signature was good, I can now trust this OpenID Connect ID token because I've validated all the way back to my specific tenant in Okta. All right? And so that's how, similar to a Kerberos ticket, which has some signatures and some other stuff in it, you now have kind of a self-contained blob that has all of the information about the user, potentially even some custom attributes and other stuff that you've passed through from whatever your source of truth is, and you've got a signature block on this, so you can validate it back that it actually came from the identity provider that you expected. For us, this is really cool because this means we have a nice, handy, standalone way of validating the user. It's cryptographically signed, and we get the information about it. All right? So this is why a lot of people like OpenID Connect and makes it a little bit different from SAML, because once you get some of these libraries and stuff in place, it's a lot easier to parse and you get a lot more information out of it. This, user record in particular. If you're more of a Microsoft shop, you can use jwt.ms, and I can paste in my token and it will decode it here and even give me a little bit more information on what some of these things mean. All right, so 2 places that you can easily go in and do this. And we definitely suggest that as you're working with OpenID Connect and setting it up within your user environment, that it's a handy thing to have jwt.io and jwt.ms available so you can go to these and actually validate your tokens. Make sure you're getting the right things. And that way, in many cases, if you're just the Mac admin, you then go back to the identity team and you can say, you told me you were putting the groups in the token, but you're not. All right? So this gives you a little bit leverage when you work with that identity team because you know exactly what's coming through. Cool. So that was the fun demo. Let's go back to the slides here. So what does this mean to you? Why is this relevant? what's useful for this? Well, now that we've kind of understood a little bit more about what identity is and what modern authentication can be, how it works a little bit under the covers, let's talk about some of the instances on macOS in particular where this shows up. And we bring this up because Catalina has done some really, really cool things. Catalina's got some great new single sign-on and other aspects to it. However, there's been a lot of commingling of all these terms, and you end up someplace where maybe you're left a little less than satisfied. All right? So hopefully we have a little discussion here. This is the exciting part. All right, that's good. You're learning. At least I hope it's the exciting part. Otherwise, we'll do something else. So I wanted to kind of break down some of these things that are new in Catalina and kind of explain how they fit into what you're doing and how they make sense for you. Important thing, no matter what I say from here on out, really excited about where Catalina's gone. All right? There is some cool things. This is Apple thinking a lot more about single sign-on, a lot more about modern authentication, and that's a great thing. And so we're excited that they're doing more of that. The kind of major thing that we talk about here, enrollment customization, you saw this a couple of times in the demo yesterday. This is during the DEP authentication. You can now have custom HTML and other things coming through there. So in many cases, this is where authentication now starts for you. So that's modern authentication. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Login window, system authentication, this is a little bit different, right? This is where you're at the login window, which is different than at the DEP window, where you're creating users or authenticating as a user or authenticating within the system itself. Then SSO extensions, talk about those for a little bit, and then we'll finally finish up on some of the helpers, all right, and what you can do with that. So enrollment customization, this was new to Catalina, and under the covers, it effectively just allows MDM to pause the process, right? You just enrolled in DEP. Before you actually get the agent or the Jamf binary or whatever it is that you're putting down onto the system pauses and you see a web page. All right. If you went to the keynote yesterday, you saw that we can put up end user license agreements. We can do all kinds of fun stuff there. Your own custom markdown, I think, is what we do. You can also have an authentication screen. Really cool. However, none of that really passes through to the system. All right. So this is where there's a bit of a disconnect in how this works. And so on the Mac, your Mac pauses, and your Mac lets MDM put whatever URL it wants to into that display page, right? The Mac patiently waits until MDM actually sends a command that pretty much just says, go to the next step. If MDM never sends that command, you're stuck at the authentication screen or something else. You don't have the ability to go forward. What isn't happening is nothing is written down to the local machine. There's no token, that ID token and things like that we just talked about. None of that goes to the system. All of that has to either go back through the MDM system to get pushed down, or some alternative way has to go down there. All right? And that's where the biggest disconnect that we've seen a lot of people when we talk about this, that they think because it's being shown in that window, it magically passes through. Well, in IT, nothing is magic. Somebody like those of us in this room have to be there to make it work. So this is where we're actually doing some of this work. You saw some of that yesterday as well between Jamf Connect and Jamf Pro. But back to that Roach Motel slide that I had, one of the biggest issues here is that in that modern authentication, we don't necessarily ever get the password out of it. So this is where, in some cases, you might think this is a regression from the 10.14 behavior, because in 10.14, if you had this wired up to LDAP, you could put in a username and password, and then the Mac would create an account based upon that. The reason why that can't be done today is that, one, the Mac never gets any of this information, unless MDM pushes it down to it, right? The Mac itself doesn't see what's going on in that web view. And two, it's very possible that no password was ever entered. And then you'd be in this very, very weird state where you may have used a one-time password or Okta push or something like that, where you wouldn't have typed in a password. Well, how do we create a user account if you don't have a password? Gets kind of hard. That's one of the things that we've been working on with the iOS app that we showed yesterday and this morning, where you might not need a password because we're effectively being a smart card for you. But until that's out, this is where you are. All right, login window and system authentication. There's primarily two ways to authenticate at the login window. One is the one we know and love, which is a password. Sometimes that password gets set up through LDAP. Sometimes it goes back through the AD plugin. Sometimes it just goes locally against a local password hash. There's another way. Who's using smart cards in the room? Wow. That is a lot more than I was expecting. Okay. For those of you on the live stream, millions, about 20% of the room raised their hands, which is a little bit surprising. We usually see it a little less than that. But, so Crypto Token Kit, CTK, that's the ability to use a smart card to sign in at the login window. So instead of using a password, you're actually doing a cryptographic process. You've got a public and a private key on your smart card, your YubiKey, your phone, something like that, and then we're using that to connect in. At the login window, you can have custom mechanisms. Jamf Connect, NoMAD Login are both examples of that. Crypt, if you're Crypt users in the house. Okay, a few of them. So that's a custom login mechanism for the login window. It's not really setting your password or authenticating you, but it is doing some work at the login window. All right? And some customization of this is possible, but at the end of the day, the Mac still has to have one or two things to sign you in. It either has to have a password that matches a hash or some sort of directory service, or it has to have some sort of token using Crypto Token Kit to authenticate you in. There is no step 3, there is no modern authentication, there is nothing else in here. And so this is where some of the pieces don't always line up between coming from that custom enrollment at DEP to then having to create the new local account to then doing things elsewhere in the system. All right? Single sign-on extensions. Who's got a single sign-on extension? Let the record show no hands came up. That's not a surprise. Single sign-on extensions, there's two types. There's the one you really get excited about and the one that is fine, but maybe not as earth-shattering. The one you really get excited about is the redirect or the modern auth. So if you are using Okta, Azure, something else, a single sign-on extension perhaps may give you the ability for users to sign in fewer times, right? Because the joke is, yes, it's the same password, but between Salesforce, MySpace, Twitter, 18 other web properties, I keep having to sign in over and over again. It's always the same username, it's always the same password, but it really isn't single sign-on per se. And I've even heard some people referring it to SSSO, which is like solely single sign-on or something else like that, to designate the fact that when we finally reach triple SO, that's when you won't have to type in passwords ever again, right? So in the single sign-on extension is one of the potential methods of getting to here. I think it's really exciting. There's some cool stuff. So let's talk about them. So there's two types. Credential is the Kerberos one. This is the one that's built into the Mac and iOS. So starting in iOS 13 or macOS Catalina, you now have a credential or Kerberos extension. All right? Built in, whether you want it there or not, you do want it there. It's not a problem. And you can enable it through a configuration profile. Okay, I'll show you that in just a second. This allows you effectively what you could do with Enterprise Connect or to some degree with NoMAD, in that you do have the ability to prompt a user for Kerberos credentials and to generate or to acquire a local Kerberos ticket for that. That then is effectively single sign-on because you have a Kerberos ticket and go into many things. Some stuff that's good, some stuff that's not good about that. The next one is the redirect, so this is the modern auth one. But a couple of things to keep in mind as to what single sign-on extensions aren't. Single sign-on extensions are in no way a directory service. All right? They do not get you a user record. They do not sign you into the Mac. They don't do anything for you until you've already signed in, and then you're signing into a particular service. All right? So important to keep in mind exactly what they are. They're designed to be a way that the user doesn't have to be constantly prompted for the same username and password across a variety of things and a variety of web browsers and other pieces. However, they can't sign you into the Mac, and very important to keep in mind, there's no real relation between what a managed Apple ID is and what a single sign-on extension is. Who's using any of the new managed Apple IDs between ABM and ASM? So we've got a few hands up there. And those are really cool, right? Because now you don't have to go around and generate your own Apple IDs for the users. You've got a little bit more management from an organizational perspective. However, they don't really have anything to do with an SSO extension. That's a whole different sign-in, right? If you line these all up, you can sign in for DEP, you can sign in for Apple ID, managed Apple ID, then you can sign at the login window. We're still not in a real single sign-on environment, right? But we're getting there. More pieces are in place than ever before. All right, so the built-in Kerberos extension, this works as a way to sign into your Mac, no relation to managed Apple IDs. We'll cover this in post. That's the same bullet points as before. Ignore that slide. All right, single sign-on extensions. This is how you turn them on. There's two important things. If you're in Jamf Pro, you've got an extension identifier, com.apple.app SSO Kerberos.Kerberos extension. Type that in, and then under team identifier, Apple cheats. Well, there's probably some people from Apple here. Apple doesn't cheat. Apple just makes things easy on themselves in that they sign with a variety of certificates and other things. So you don't actually have to put in a team ID. If you created your own single sign-on extension, you would have to have your own team ID on here. However, with Apple, all you have to do is put in Apple, and then you've enabled the Kerberos single sign-on extension on the Mac and on iOS. Who's using this on the Mac? Couple hands. Okay. Do you like it? I mean, it's good. It's not bad, but it's not everything that you wanted, right? I was hoping, so as the originator of NoMAD, that I wouldn't have, dirty secret, I wouldn't have to do NoMAD anymore. Who still wants to use NoMAD? Let the record show every hand in the room went up. No, but there's a good chunk, right? Because NoMAD adds in a lot more pieces with file shares being mounted and things like that. So while the Kerberos extension is really cool, and when you're a user, what you see happening, if you go to a web page that requires Kerberos authentication and you don't already have a ticket, you'll get prompted to sign in. That will generate a Kerberos ticket for you, and then hopefully you shouldn't have to sign in again. So it's a good thing. However, there's a lot of other pieces that go with it, such as file share mounting, password resets, all these kinds of things that are a little bit more than what the single sign-on extension was ever really designed to do, all right? And so that's why I think single sign-on extensions are great, and they can help you, but they're not necessarily the end of the world or where they need to go. So the thing that most people are interested in is the redirect extension. So the redirect extension is a piece of software that when you sign into one property, you sign into Salesforce and you authenticate there. When you open up another app or you go to another web page, you'd be able to be automatically signed in again by the single sign-on extension, all right? For the most part, with some exceptions, but not really, these have to come from your identity provider. So if you're an Azure customer, it needs to come from Microsoft. If you're an Okta customer, it needs to come from Okta. If you're a OneLogin customer, it needs to come from OneLogin. Who's shipped one of these yet? No one. Okay? I think they'll be great when they come out, but there's a lot of moving pieces that are part of it. If you want to learn more about that, I will recommend you go to documentation.macsysadmin.se. Did I get the URL right? All right, Patrick, a little shout out to Patrick. So I did a session specifically on the Kerberos and the credential redirect extensions at macsysadmin a couple of months ago. Not a couple of weeks ago. Wow, a month ago. So there's a 45-minute, 50-minute session on that. So read that and then give me really good reviews on, because Patrick's going to open up the feedback forum for macsysadmin, because I think he tallied the votes wrong. I'm positive he tallied the votes wrong. So then you can give me some better feedback on there. So that's a place to go where you can learn more about this and you can understand that. All right. So important to keep in mind, I think single sign-on extensions are really great. The Kerberos one is already in there. It is in there for the Mac and for the iPad, iPadOS, iOS. You can see that in this session, so you get a little more information about that. And they're cool. They help, but they don't solve the bigger problem. They don't allow the user to sign in. They don't create the accounts. They don't actually create that identity on the machine. Instead, they're solely focused on just kind of cutting down the number of times you have to sign in. And that leaves us with the last piece here. Whoops, that's the wrong button. There we go. And so the kind of the helpers. And so we've got Jamf Connect, we've got NoMAD. Some of you may have Enterprise Connect. And these kind of fill in a little bit of the gaps between the pieces where Apple hasn't plugged everything in entirely yet, because it's still a work in progress. And the goal here is to make your life a little bit simpler, to glue in some of these pieces, to create the accounts, to manage your identities, and to do things like that. NoMAD is still out there. Like I said, I was thinking that maybe with what came in Catalina and 10.13, we wouldn't need it anymore, but I really don't think that's the case. I've had a number of people that have talked to me that they're still excited and interested about it, specifically around the customization parts, file mounts, and things like that. Obviously, Jamf Connect, something near and dear to my heart and to those of us at Jamf, using that in as many ways as possible. If you want to learn more about Jamf Connect, that's the session after this, I believe below us. So in the main ballroom downstairs, where we're going to be going into more detail about some of the cool things that you can do there. And then Enterprise Connect, if you're an Enterprise Connect customer, I don't think you can get it anymore, right? No.
Support through end of Catalina.
Support through end of Catalina. So it's out there. If you're using it, great. That will also help fill in some of the gaps where the built-in Kerberos single sign-on extension maybe doesn't do everything, right? So with that, and NoMAD, look at that. Gratuitous keynote drop, because we couldn't end this without that in there. Ooh, exactly. We have that. So with that, happy to take some questions if anybody has them. I think we have a few minutes. But hopefully this gave you kind of a decent idea of a lot of the building blocks of identity, got you into some of the specifics about how you can use an OpenID Connect token, open that up. JWT.io or JWT.ms is a good place to go. Even if you're not a Jamf Connect customer, and everybody should be, of course, you can still download Jamf Connect and get that configuration utility. And if you want to play around with just kind of OpenID Connect, if you've got Okta, Azure, one of the others, you can actually set up that config utility, and it will show you those tokens and the other things that you're getting. Okay, with that, do we have any questions?
I have the mic. I can mic you up.
Over in front, the MySpace user.
Do I get a golden hoodie so I can, that says I'm a MySpace user now?
Oh, well, you know, you go into Amazon, you can find anything you want.
No, right? So I didn't know that that base 64 URL could be decoded.
Oh, yeah.
So my InfoSec guy is going to go, wait, there's information being passed around in an unsecure way and all of that. So is that ever going to be addressed, or is that something I should worry about, or should I just tell him to quit
So a
drinking
couple
coffee?
of responses to that. Yes, it's in there, but it's all SSL encrypted between the two sides.
Okay.
So your Jamf Pro instance does get that, or it can if it asks for it. However, that connection back to Okta is covered by an SSL connection. So nobody could really see what's going on in there. There is, within the protocol, the ability to have an encrypted token. However, then you've got to manage all these secrets on all the sides to be able to encrypt it, and that just gets to be a nightmare.
Okay.
Now, the right answer, though, is if your identity person is concerned about this, your identity person should actually see what's in the token and then decide if there's something in there that's overly sensitive or something that shouldn't be in there. However, in most cases, if that token doesn't go across, the user won't be able to sign in because the other side doesn't realize exactly who you are and what some of your information is. Does that make sense?
Yep, makes sense. Thanks.
Cool. Any other questions?
Any others?
Second row.
Yay. Yeah, they're all close. Thank you. I have boots on today.
What are the key differences between NoMAD login and Jamf Connect?
Sure. There's a lot of code similarity between them. No shock there that we brought that in. Biggest difference is that Jamf Connect uses modern authentication. So if you're going against Azure, if you're going against Okta, if you're going against an IDP, Jamf Connect. Anything that uses on-prem AD, that's what the NoMAD kind of family covers. So if you have on-prem AD and you want to create users at the login window there, NoMAD login, perfect. Go. Cool. Any other questions? Fourth row, in the middle.
Yeah, just curious on the integration between NoMAD and Jamf Connect. Is the plan to eventually migrate all the features from NoMAD into Jamf Connect?
Sure. So the question is, because the mic just got to you, NoMAD and Jamf Connect have sets of features, and that Venn diagram doesn't always cross. Yes, the goal is to bring as much of the interesting things out of NoMAD into Jamf Connect. To some degree, for some things that are a little more out there, we use NoMAD as kind of the, hey, see if you like this, because it's really easy for us to just kind of put it in there, put it into the Slack channel and see if people are using it. We're a little hesitant to bring too much of the AD code in, because if you're moving to modern authentication, we'd rather you just focus completely on modern authentication and kind of leave some of the AD bits behind you. So there's probably some pieces of that that will never get moved over. So there's that. And then we also hope the flow kind of goes backwards a little bit as well, that when we get some of the cooler new features in Jamf Connect, that some of those will make them back as appropriate into NoMAD and the rest. So you're right, it's not 100% overlap, and we apologize for that confusion. We've got some people from the dev team over here that throw things at me because some of this is my fault. In that I get into GitLab and I'm like, oh yeah, this would be cool. And then I put it out on the Slack channel and then they're like, oh, crap. That's not on the roadmap. What are we going to do? So I take some of that blame. But yeah, we are trying to keep them as similar as possible. You notice a lot of the pref keys are the same between them. At some point in time, there will be a singularity where the whole Jamf Connect suite becomes one app, and maybe we just then use the same code for NoMAD. We're going to kind of see where it goes. Like I said, to be perfectly honest, I was kind of thinking maybe NoMAD didn't need to be continued beyond Catalina because some of the built-in stuff, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So, cool. Other questions?
We have actually run out of time.
We have run out of time.
I'm so sorry.
All right. Thank you very much for coming. Enjoy the rest
Thank
of the
you,
week.
Joel.